Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to another SIP seminar. It's our pleasure today to have Professor Jie Gao from the Computer Science Department at Rutgers University give the talk on graph-Ricci flow and applications in network analysis and learning. Just to give us some background about Professor Gao's research and pedigree, she received her PhD from Stanford University and then did a postdoc from Caltech, and after that, she was on the faculty of Computer Science Department at Stony Brook, where she remained till 2019, and then Rutgers was lucky to have her join the computer science here. Since 2019, she's a professor in the Computer Science Department. She has received a number of awards in her career, including the NSF Career Award, the IMC Best Paper Award, multiple Research Excellence Awards from Stony Brook, and she currently serves on the editorial board of two journals, has published upwards of hundreds of papers, and her research interests are in computer networking and theoretical computer science. And with this, it's a real pleasure that she's here to tell us some about her latest research. So with that, I'll hand it over to her. All yours.
Thanks, Wahid. Thanks for having me. I want to share some of our recent work on graph-Ricci flow, which is a geometrical approach for network analysis and learning. So again, I welcome all questions to come, just stop me when you have any questions. So let me see. Generally, I'm very interested in analysis or understanding complex networks. So complex networks appear in many applications ranging from social networks, the biological networks, the internet backbone, the web, etc. And complex networks have many interesting properties such as small world phenomena, the power law degree distribution, community structure, etc. So what we have been doing in the recent years is to use a geometric tool to understand and analyze complex networks. And this comes from the definition of curvature, which was originally defined for continuous surfaces, but now adapted to the discrete setting. And using this curvature flow to develop metrics for understanding connectivity of a graph and use it for many applications. I'm hoping to give you examples of the three applications: network alignment, like how to compare two networks, community detection, and also the neural network graph learning. So let me start with curvatures. So curvature is a classical notion for a surface. So it basically defines how much the surface curves around a point. So if we have a plane, then we understand it's flat, or in other words, curvature is zero everywhere. And if we have, for example, a saddle point, then the curvature at the saddle point is negative. Or in other words, around that saddle point, if you look at how much the area grows, it actually grows faster than the case of a plane. It grows possibly exponentially fast as a function of the radius. Or if you think about a sphere, a ball, then the curvature on the sphere is positive. So all of these notions, we can find corresponding analogs for the network setting, the graph setting. So for a network that has a tree shape, the curvature is intuitively negative because, again, we experience this exponential growth. And for a grid, it behaves very much like a plane. So curvature intuitively should be zero. And for a complete graph, well-connected graph, we expect curvature to be positive. And I'm going to explain the detailed definition that will match this intuition. And to start, let me just go from the continuous setting of understanding curvature and then understand how to develop the discrete analog. So when we look at a geometric surface, now curvature basically is a local definition. It describes what happens around the point. But curvature is also related to the global structure of the surface. So one interesting question that we can ask is, how do we know that the Earth is round, right? How do we know we are not living on a flat plane? Of course, we can fly to space and then look back, right? You'll see a ball. Another way to look at this is to think about, we start at the North Pole, and then suppose we walk towards the equator. And once we reach the equator, we make a left turn, 90-degree right turn. And then we start to walk along the equator for a while. And then we make another left turn, 90-degree. Now, if we leave on a plane, then this is going to give us a line, right? And then walk straight. This is going to give us a parallel line. So we will never be able to come to the starting position. But for a sphere, by the earlier procedure, we actually walk back to the starting position. So this is one of the fundamental difference of traveling on a sphere which is not flat. And this could be used for one of the definitions of curvature. So here is the definition for sectional curvature. And you will see, this has some relationship with that earlier exercise. So let's consider a tangent vector, V, that connects to points X and Y on the surface. And let's consider another tangent vector, WX, located at X. And we're going to move this tangent vector along the earlier vector V from X to Y. So we have another tangent vector defined on Y. And now the sectional curvature basically says, let's look at these two tangent vector WX and WY. And we ask whether these two vectors are parallel, or they converge, or they diverge. Okay, for the case of a sphere, actually these two vectors, tangent vectors, are going to converge. They're coming closer. So the notion of sectional curvature is to examine the distance between X prime and Y prime on the picture, and the distance between X and Y. And depending on which one is greater or smaller, we can define correspondingly the sectional curvature for this vector. And with sectional curvature, we can go ahead and define Ricci curvature, which is basically averaging for all directions of the tangent vector W defined at X. And one of the discrete notion is to extend the sectional curvature to the discrete graph setting. So for a graph, we take an edge XY, and then we consider distance from X neighbors to Y's neighbors. And this intuitively could be understood as, somewhat the tangent vector defined on X and defined on Y. And similar to before, we want to relate the distance of this X prime, Y prime, or the other endpoints of this tangent vector and compare the distance with length of X and Y. Now, one of the difficulty here is, unless the geometric setting, we don't have the correspondence of the tangent vectors. For a graph, all the neighbors are, we don't have a ordering, we don't have a natural ordering, we don't have a natural correspondence. So the intuition is to define a distribution, X neighbors and Y's neighbors, and then look for the optimal transport distance that try to move the distribution from X neighborhood to Y's neighborhood. And the optimal transport distance look for the plan that minimize the total transport distance and use that as an average sense to compare with the distance between X and Y. So I'm going to make this formal, and this is the definition of Ollivier Ricci curvature, which is defined for general graph or other kind of discrete setting. So we have a metric space, and we assume 2 points X and Y in this metric space, and we look at probability measure M1 defined on the neighborhood of X and M2 defined on the neighborhood of Y. And this W1 from mx to my is actually the optimal transport distance. That is to move the distribution from x neighborhood to y's neighborhood. What is the minimum distance needed to allow this transportation? And we're going to compare with the distance between x and y. And depending on whether this is a number that is greater than 1 or smaller than 1 or exactly 1, we can get the definition of curvature. So let me give you some intuition using examples to see why this definition kind of makes sense and generalize the classical notion of curvature. So here is the setting of a grid, a two-dimensional grid, and I have an edge x0 to y0 is one of the center edge, right? And the neighborhood would include 5 vertices, including the node itself, right? The 4 vertices and the center one. And y's neighborhood, again, 5 vertices. Now, if I think about having a distribution on x neighborhood and y's neighborhood, in fact, the optimal transport is to just shift everything to the right by 1. And the total distance for shifting this is, in fact, exactly 1, which is the same as the distance between x and y. So according to the definition, this means on the right-hand side, I would have this 2 distance to be exactly the same. And that means I'm having curvature to be 0. So this is, in fact, a very flat graph in that notion. We could also derive in closed formula the curvature for a case of a tree. So the curvature, other than the edges that are connecting leaf nodes, everywhere else we have curvature to be negative. And again, this matches with the intuition that for a tree, we can actually grow the volume possibly exponentially fast with respect to the radius of that ball. And for a complete graph, and we have all the curvatures to be positive, again, this could be calculated easily. And let me give you an interesting example, which is the autonomous system of the internet graph. And here, I'm showing the edges in different colors. Basically, negatively curved edges are colored red, and positively curved edges are colored blue. So if you look at the internet graph, the backbone edges are basically negatively curved. And the edges that are somewhat within a community, within a group of highly clustered nodes, are actually having positive curvature. And it's an interesting observation that by using this notion of curvature, we could discover interesting structures from the internet backbone and also community structure, etc.
I had a quick question, sorry.
Sure.
Something very basic, perhaps. Is for the discrete curvature, is that a property of the node or is that a property of the edge? I guess previously I was thinking about property of the curvature you calculate on a node, but here you're talking about curvature of edges.
Right. So in the geometric setting, it's often defined on a node, on a point. That is the Ricci curvature. But here we're defining on an edge, which is the analog of sectional curvature. That is the point plus a direction. So here is for each edge, we have a curvature. Of course, we can also define curvature for a point by just averaging the curvature of neighboring edges.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so let me move on to the next notion, which is called curvature flow or Ricci flow. So again, Ricci flow was a classical notion that was initially introduced by Hamilton. It's actually one of the most important tools for proving the Poincare conjecture. And here we discover that the Ricci flow defined in the geometric setting has a lot of similarity with the community structure in a graph setting. So I'm showing some pictures. And on the left, this is what happens, what mathematicians understood of running Ricci flow for a surface. So initially, you may have a manifold, or in other words, a shape that is weird, right? But when you run Ricci flow, the intuition being, I'm trying to smooth out the curvature, trying to make curvature everywhere the same. And what happens is the manifold under Ricci flow may just blow up to like a sphere, or a uniformly curved surface, or may develop what's called the singularities. And that is shown in the left, that actually the surface may get stretched and the singularity point is right in the middle. At some point, actually the surface could be split at the singularity. So on the right-hand side, I'm showing the analog of the same formula, but again, applied for a graph setting. So here we have the initial graph with two communities. And when we run this Ricci flow that I will explain very soon, we actually discover that communities are naturally separated, with the edges connecting the two communities to be stretched, while the edges within the community to be made shorter. So this becomes a very intuitive algorithm for community detection. So with that intuition in mind, let me introduce the details of exactly how this process is done. So we have the graph, and we define the curvature for each edge of the graph. And now I'm going to apply a dynamic process. Here, I'm trying to modify the length of edges proportional to the curvature of the edge. So in iterations, we're going to modify the distance between x and y, right, the edge length, by a term which is proportional to the current curvature. So kappa is the curvature between x and y, and I'm applying this normalization term just to make sure that the network does not blow up, okay, to make sure the size remain reasonable. And this basically does the following. So if I have an edge that is negatively curved, so kappa being negative, that means I'm going to make this length to be longer, right? If I have a curvature to be positive, then I'm going to make this edge to be shorter. And that is what's happening in this dynamic process. And here, of course, when we define the curvature, we are introducing a distribution on the neighborhood. In the Ollivier's definition, the original definition, this distribution is taken as a uniform distribution on all the neighbors. And we also use that in some of our applications that I will talk about later. But we also discovered that for community detection, it is better to use the distribution which apply a discount for the neighbor that is far away. Intuitively, if I have a very long edge connecting to a neighbor, now I should not consider that node to be a really important neighbor. So the probability mass allocated to that far away neighbor is heavily discounted. I'm taking an exponential e to the power of minus the distance to each of the neighbor as the definition of the distribution. So, okay, so here is, the dynamics, and here I'm going to show what happens when we apply this for a real graph. So this graph is a famous karate club network that we know there are two communities, and these are labeled red and green. And initially, So all the edges are given weight of 1. So in the histogram shown below, all the edges have the same weight. And then if we look at the edges have different curvature, right? So certain edges are red and certain edges are blue. Now we're going to run Ricci flow, which is to modify the edge length by the curvature. And it turns out that after a number of iterations, I will get to the second figure where the edge weights show clear difference. There are a group of edges that are very short and a group of edges that are very long. And in fact, we see 3 clusters of edge lengths. And we're going to apply a surgery here, that is to cut all the edges that are super long. And I'm cutting the edges with weight greater than 4, and this essentially cut all of the edges that connect these 2 big communities. And what we obtain as the identified community, in fact, almost matches the ground truth, except the one vertex, which is kind of ambiguous anyway, even in the original graph. And we can even apply this in a hierarchical manner. If we apply another surgery, that is to remove all the edges of weight greater than 2, we get one of the communities to be further partitioned into 2 smaller groups.
So there's a question in the chat. Someone asked that how do you select the constant P in the community detection?
This cutoff threshold, right?
Right.
Yeah. So that's a very good question, first of all. So in this process, we actually don't have a mathematically defined threshold. But what we have observed is there's often a very clear choice that you basically see this 2 group of lengths, and there is going to be something that is super, super long compared to the others, and it just makes sense to cut there. Yeah. We do have limited theoretical understanding on a very special graph, but we don't have the analysis for general graph. And a very recent work, I want to say that shows the convergence of the discrete Ricci flow. But again, we still don't know, again, the mathematical notion of where to cut and what is a threshold, etc. That is still open.
Thank you. I also had a quick question from the computational aspect. So how much, what's the general complexity of computing the curvature of a graph? I presume it will be a function of the average degree or things like that.
Yes. So there are 2 steps. There are 2 parts that are somewhat computationally heavy. One is we need to run the all pair shortest path to get the all pair distances. This is still okay. We can speed it up, parallel, and so on. The other part is to do the optimal transport, which is to calculate, if we want to calculate the exact one, we do a LP, right? But in our implementation, we use the sinkhorn distance, which is an approximation of the optimal transport distance. And that is substantially faster than the exact calculation. And that basically make it to be feasible to calculate the curvature and flow even for very large graphs. So for reasonable desktop, you can run this quickly, and in a few seconds you get the result. Yeah.
Thank you.
Hi, Jie. I just have a quick clarification question about the algorithm. So my understanding is that the Ricci curvature is updated after every iteration. So once you update the distance of the length of each edge, you recompute the Ricci curvature for all the nodes, and you do this iteratively. Yep. Is that right?
Yes, that's right.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. All right. So if no other questions, let's move on. So I'm showing another figure where we have the Facebook ego network. And this is a much larger graph with lots of edges. And there's also ground truth community labeled by the different colors. And actually the the right-hand side, the third picture on the one on the right shows what we get after using Ricci flow for community detection. In some cases, we cut the community to a much refined detail, but the colors basically match the ground truth, pretty well. And again, this gets back to basically how to choose the threshold. So as I said earlier, right? So in most of the applications, the graphs that we have tested, it's very clear where to cut it because there is a threshold that separate the very long edges with the rest of the edges. And this figure I'm showing basically this modularity that shows if we choose that cutoff, it does give me something that has a very high modularity for the obtained community structure. And we also compared with a number of other community detection algorithms. This is an old problem, right? People work on this and use algorithms from very different disciplines. And what we want to get from this picture is, so the x-axis basically shows a parameter that controls how likely we have a community structure. So this mu, when it is small, we have very clear community structure. When mu is large, then the graph starts to behave, like a random graph, and it's very hard to see whether there's any community at all. And the best is to have a community detection algorithm that basically has a very sharp threshold. That is, we can detect even for very ambiguous setting. And then at some point, right, when the graph start to lose community structure, then maybe we just give up and say, okay, we cannot find it. So compared with other alternatives, the Ricci flow actually behaves relatively well among the top few that has consistently a very high performance of identifying the ground truth community. And then when the graph start to lose the structure, then basically has a very sharp drop of performance for this cutoff threshold. And the last thing I want to say about this particular application is with respect to that distribution of choice. So we choose to heavily discount the neighbors that are far away by using the distribution to allocate a very small probability to that neighbor. And I'm showing for different choice of parameters for that distribution. And it turns out that for community detection, because our goal is to separate this different groups as fast as possible, choosing a higher value of that parameter P is actually a good idea. It's going to speed up the process and quickly kind of get the two communities separated. Okay, so we're working on this Ricci flow. We also discover a very nice property by looking at what we get after we run Ricci flow. So after we run this, we get the curvature to be uniform everywhere. At some point, we also have a redefined length for each edge. And we can compute all pair shortest paths for this graph, this weighted graph. And we call this the Ricci flow metric. And an interesting observation is that this metric turns out to be much more robust to dynamics changes of the topology, like adding edges or removing edges. So I'm showing a number of comparisons, a number of figures to show how this compares with alternative metric defined on a graph. So here I'm showing basically the karate club, and I'm showing different embedding methods. The left one is spectral embedding, which is to get the graph Laplacian and then do the eigen decomposition and find the coordinate of vertices in the plane, and that will give us a distance for each edge in the graph. And I'm also measuring what happens if I start to delete edges in the graph. So I'm removing 2 edges, and I'm calculating the shortest path distance after the deletion, and by doing the spectral embedding again. And turns out that this spectral embedding, as is known already, is very sensitive to insertion and deletion of edges. So the color of the vertices basically show amount of changes in the spectral embedding metric after the deletion of 2 edges. So you can see that there are vertices with a very dark color. That means there's a lot of changes. On the right, we show a different embedding, which is the spring embedding. That is to treat all the edges to be rubber band, right? And once we fixed some vertices and let the other edges go, the network will by itself reach an equilibrium state, and then we have again the edges defined and the length defined for the edges. Again, for the spring embedding, we also observe like sensitivity to insertion and deletion of edges. Correspondingly, if we look at other metric, for example, hop count, just minimum number of hops connecting 2 vertices, it turns out that is super, super robust. And this is probably not surprising because of the small world property, that if you have a complex network and you look at the shortest path defined by the minimum number of hops, often you have, a certain level of redundancy. You have, duplication, that there are multiple shortest paths. So even after some edges are deleted, the graph, if you look at shortest path, you still have roughly the same value. So here, if I look at the color of the vertices, you see most of them are close to being white. That shows very small changes in the shortest path distance. And on the right, this is what we have with the Ricci flow metric. So after removing 2 edges, turns out that the shortest path length after we run Ricci flow again does not vary that much. It is much more robust compared to alternative embedding. And this is not a coincidence. There are reasons, because if we look at the definition of Ricci flow upon convergence, basically we're trying to minimize the difference of the distance of one edge and the distance of like traveling without traveling this edge, like going through the neighborhood, like finding a detour or alternative way. We're trying to make these 2 distances to be matched. And this essentially says we're trying to find this distance definition that try to be more robust to the perturbation of the topology. So a different way to show this is shown on the following figure, where again we have a random graph. We're removing some edges randomly, and we're looking at basically the change in the shortest path distance. And for hop count, the second last is very robust. And for the Ricci flow metric, for what we have, is also relatively robust. But for spectral embedding, the green one, and also the spring embedding, we actually do see high sensitivity to dynamic changes. And this nice property motivates us to look at the following application, where the robustness to dynamic changes is going to be really helpful. So this is the classical problem of graph isomorphism. That is, if I have 2 graphs, but I don't have the correspondence of vertices, and I'm asking whether we can find the correspondence so that the topology match. So in the figure, we show two graphs. And if we look at them, they look like very different graphs. But in fact, these are the same, exactly the same graph. If we match the vertices of the same color, you see the edges match perfectly. So we try to tackle this problem by using the Ricci flow metric and by using this geometric approach. So suppose we don't have graphs, but we have instead just point set in the plane. So we have 2 point set and we try to align them. And one simple method is to define landmarks. So in this setting, I have 3 landmarks and I'm gonna match the landmarks first. And this, if we have a small number of landmarks, we can actually just do enumeration to try to match them. And after that, we can define the coordinate of every other point by the barycentric coordinate, which is the distance to the 3 landmarks. So for this point P, I'm going to measure distance to the 3 landmarks L1, L2, L3, and then use this vector as a definition of coordinate for P. Similarly, on the right, I'm going to do the same thing. For each point, I define this vector as a barycentric coordinate. And then to align these 2 point set, I'm just going to choose the points with their barycentric coordinate to be the same and just match them. So we're using this idea for the graph problem. Basically, we have the 2 graphs, and suppose we have some landmarks that we know they are matched already. And I'm going to define the Ricci flow metric for each of the graphs. And because the Ricci flow metric is reasonably robust, even if the graphs may have some random edges inserted or deleted, even if it's in practice, we never have exact match, right? We always have some kind of noise. Then the Ricci flow metric is still reasonable. We're going to define the distance to the landmarks and use that to try to match the vertices in the graph. And this turns out to work much better than, again, alternative metrics and other ideas. So I'm showing just some figures on the performance for both random regular graphs and also real-world graphs like a protein-protein network. So even with a very small number of landmarks, so here I'm choosing just 3, 4, or 5 landmarks, and I'm trying to measure the recovery accuracy. And it turns out that using Ricci flow to be the distance measure of the network, we can discover a lot of information of where a point is with respect to the other landmarks. And alternatively, if we look at other kind of distance definition, for spectral embedding, it doesn't work very well because it's super sensitive to noise. And the same thing for spurion embedding. Now, for hop count measure, we show it's very robust, but resolution is horrible. For hop count, we always get an integer value. And for anything that behaves like a complex network, we have small diameter. So hop count is just an integer, a small integer, right? So we have a diameter of 6. It's a small integer that varies from 1 to 6. So it doesn't provide a lot of resolution to be useful for this problem of aligning 2 graphs. So correspondingly, the Ricci flow metric has a nice balance between having enough information and resolution to distinguish vertices and also being robust to dynamic changes in the topology. Okay, so we're using this, again, the robustness feature also in this application of graph learning. Graph neural network is one of the most popular machine learning approach when we try to learn something from a large network data. So I'm not going to go through all the details of graph neural network, but basically, one family of graph neural network, the spatial type, is trying to learn in an iterative manner the feature of the neighborhood and abstract it, and then go to another layer, and then just do this in an iterative manner to learn representation of a network. Now, one of the problem with a graph neural network, similar to many other neural network applications, is the robustness issue, vulnerability to adversarial perturbations. And for the graph setting, this is a more serious problem, because the input graph is used also as the architecture of the neural network. So we define our operations, the receptive field on the graph as well. So if adversaries start to perturb the input edges by adding some edges in a malicious manner, the performance of a neural network can drop significantly. So we try to see if we understand a graph by defining a very robust metric, maybe we can use that to improve the robustness of graph learning. And that is the idea here in this application. So we take the standard graph neural network routine where we have a graph, we apply it in each level of that graph neural network pipeline. But instead of using that graph, we're going to replace that by using the more robust Ricci flow metric. So I'm going to show the outline. So the idea is we take the initial graph and we're trying to run Ricci flow to try to discover the distance between vertices, which is more robust than other ways of measuring how far away they are. And then we're going to get this distance metric, which is here. And we're going to resample from this metric and use the resampled graph for each of the iteration in the neural network training. And by resampling every time from this robust metric, we enforce the training to not focus on the particular topology of the input too much, but try to remember and learn from this underlying, the more robust Ricci flow metric. And this turns out to show much better performance and in terms of robustness to adversarial attack. And I want to give you this picture to help to get the intuition. So this picture shows an artificial network that we generate. It's a stochastic block model that we have 5 communities. Within the communities, the edges have the pairs have a higher probability to be connected by edges. And across communities, we have a much lower probability to connect vertices. And there are actually a few pairs of communities where we don't have any edges at all. And in the first figure, I'm showing both the real edges and also these adversarial edges. These are shown in red. So imagine adversary try to destroy the neural network and try to insert edges in an adversarial manner. And these are shown as the red edges. So what we do is we take this graph with both authentic edges and the adversarial edges, and we try to run Ricci flow to recover the distances between the vertices. And that is the matrix on the right. So you see that we still recover the 5 communities reasonably well. And we also recover these inter-community edges. And here for some of these inter-community cases, we still have something, right? We still have some distances. These are actually created by these adversarial edges. And then what happened is if we sample from this graph, now you see that is the figure on the bottom left. we recovered roughly the structure, but we're still affected by these adversarial edges. But on the right, I'm taking the intersection of two randomly sampled graph. And by taking the intersection, in fact, these adversarial edges are largely removed. And while the other edges still remain. And this is the intuition, as I understand, why robustness is enhanced. It is by kind of forcing the neural network training to not focus too much on one single input topology, but rather try to focus on the underlying metric distance that are represented by this input topology. So, here are some numbers. Again, it might be just boring to look at them, but the main message is when we look at the perturbation rate, here we're perturbing at a very aggressive rate. So perturbing like 25% of the edges. And in fact, correspondingly, if we look at the Ricci flow-based neural network approach, it is much more robust than the other approaches. And in some cases, even without perturbation at all, I think the performance is also the best, because of the attempt of trying to capture something that is more global and less sensitive to the particular input structure per se. So I'm going to skip this and let me see. I have about 10 minutes, so let me first conclude. So this is some of the work we have done on using geometric tools for understanding discrete graphs, especially complex networks. I want to say that the Ricci flow, the process, is generating a metric, that is distance of vertices in the graph. It is, however, not giving an embedding. And we think it's a feature not to give an embedding. Network embedding is a big topic in network analysis. But when we think about embedding, we have to think about what space to use. Are we embedding it in Euclidean space or hyperbolic space? Euclidean space, what dimension? And sometimes these choices are not very obvious. And if we have to choose a certain dimension, it feels like some limitation because it may introduce unnecessary bias, unnecessary distortion. So we believe that by focusing on a robust metric rather than the embedding, we're actually getting more freedom and less restriction and possibly less distortion due to this artificial enforcement of the choice. And we're looking for more applications of this geometric approach, especially applications that would benefit from this robustness property of the metric. And another question, or we have left after doing all of this, is the following question. That is, when we look at a complex network, we see community structure almost everywhere. And we just wonder, why community structure? Why do we always have community in, networks from very different application settings? If we look at other properties of complex networks, there are theories to explain it. Small world phenomena, for example, when you have random edges, then you start to bring down the diameter quickly. And power law degree distribution, and this is due to preferential attachment. Again, they're a very nice theory to explain why this shows up. So the corresponding question we ask is, why is community structure a persistent feature in nature? And are there some theories that would explain it? And this is some of the very recent work that we did, which is a co-evolution model of opinion dynamics and also social tie evolution. And we basically show that community structure would be a natural consequence of this co-evolution of opinion on vertices in a social network setting, and also the social tie strengths. So we have two properties here, two dynamics here. One is because we live in a social network, so our opinions are influenced by the neighbors' opinions. The other dynamic is, if we look at the social tie, there is a strength, tie strength, right, which captures possibly frequency of communication between the two individuals. And in the second dynamic model, we actually have the tie strengths updated by the agreement or disagreement of the two individuals' opinions. And turns out that we can rigorously analyze what happens when we have these two types of dynamics. And we can actually show that this will lead to a community structure, basically separated groups, each group holding their different opinions, and the tie, connecting the two groups are getting like basically weaker and weaker. Okay. And as the last slide, I want to show basically using this evolutionary model, we can also do the community detection as well, but from a evolutionary angle. I come back to the same karate club example, that what happened in history for that particular network is the club manager and also I think the coach or the administrator, I forgot. But basically there was these two individuals who had a conflict. And therefore the club is split up into two smaller groups. We actually know who they are. So one of them is this number, I think it's number 0, sorry, that's a typo. And the other one is number 33. So we actually run our dynamic model by applying initially opposing opinions of these two individuals because they start to disagree, and then just run the model until converges. And what happened is we get to these two separate groups as shown on the right. And again, this very naturally matches the reality that what happened. Other than two vertices, again, these two vertices, if we look at where they are, these are, again, somewhat ambiguous in the community partitioning. And the same thing applies for other data sets. We tested on a political block. We can use it for label propagation with very high accuracy. So with that, I'm going to just stop here. These are some of the papers that cover the Ricci flow. And we also have the code for Ricci flow, curvature, and the flow available on GitHub. So if you want to run it on your data set, test it out, feel free to grab that code.
Thank you so much, Jane. Let's give her a virtual round of applause. So we have time for a couple of quick questions. Are there any?
Yeah, I guess I'll ask a question. Super interesting work. I get two questions, but I'll just ask one and save the other after other people. So the Ricci curvature has this robustness property to say random edge insertion or deletion. So does this lend a way to say like a lot of network models, or you start with some probabilistic model and you generate a random network, and oftentimes the way people analyze it is they first show that in expectation there is a community structure, and then they show that whatever algorithm that you get is robust to the observed graph minus the expectation of the adjacency matrix. So it seems like this Ricci curvature would be perfect for those analyses because it's robust to these probabilistic edge insertion or deletions. I'm just wondering if there's any work on that or if you're thinking about that.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I agree with very much with the intuition that there seems to be the right tools for that. I also need to say that on the theoretical front, we don't know too much, unfortunately. Quantify, right, this level of robustness. So a lot of it is still open. So there's recent work that shows convergence. And the convergence is, again, on a continuous time model. It's not the discrete time model that we use in the simulation. But regarding what can we say about the final metric we get and how to quantify this robustness? And again, I want to point out that there's definitely a limit, right? Because when you start to delete a lot of things, then the network is going to break apart, right? Sure. So there's going to be intuitively a lower bound on what is possible to still, what kind of structure is still there, right? And a bound on how many edges can you delete while still keeping that structure. I think a starting point could be to look at the probabilistic model, like stochastic block model, for example, and first do the analysis over there, and then move on to the more general settings. But yes, basically all of that is at the moment still open. Yeah.
So we probably have time for only one more question if there's one last thought someone has. I mean, I guess you could go ahead with your second question if you wanted to ask that then.
Oh, my second question was just whether the robustness of the Ricci curvature is formalized, if there's any theorems that can describe it, even in limited situations. But it seems like this more of an empirical observation. Is that right, Jie?
Yes, yes, I think, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay. I guess since that was kind of answered, I'll try to ask a quick question of my own, which is that, so you focused on this for GNN robustness, you focused on Ricci GNN. I mean, the same robustness applies to GCNN, for example, also, and you just picked GNN as an example, or?
Mm-hmm. We actually use GCN.
Yes. Oh, okay. You did pick.
Yeah.
GCN. Okay.
Right. Yeah.
Okay. Sounds good. Well, since we are out of time, we'll have to leave it here. If there are other questions, I'm sure Professor Gao will be happy to entertain them. So with that, I'll thank her one more time. And
thanks for the great talk.
Yeah, thanks everyone. Yeah.
And we will have our last SIP seminar for the semester in 2 weeks' time. So hope to see you all there.